Hello, friends. Welcome to Experience Weekly Data Talk, a show featuring innovative data science leaders from around the world. Today, we're talking to James Vlahos. He's the author of Talk to Me, How Voice Computing Will Transform the Way We Live, Work, and Think. You've probably seen his writings in New York Times Magazine, Wired, Popular Science, The Atlantic, and something that he's been more famous about has been the creator of the Dadbot, which we'll get into. James, thank you so much for being on the show today.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
So I thought it was interesting, James. I had heard about the Dadbot, and it was in Wired. I had watched some videos with you talking about Dadbot, and then I picked up the book Talk to Me, and for some reason I didn't make the correlation. Like I didn't know that you were the Dadbot creator. So I thought it was interesting. So yeah, one and the same. So aside from writing about voice technology, why was it important for you to also take the extra step to actually build a bot? Because that's highly unusual.
Yeah, it is. And it came about just through organically through my own need for what was happening in my life. And to be more specific about that, that was my dad dying of cancer. And having this desire to collect his stories, to share his life stories, and I had embarked on that in a very conventional way of just sort of sitting and talking with him and doing an oral history project and recording him talking. And it was just sort of this, coincidence that I had started working on the book about voice computing at the same time, and thus knew about some of these platforms for authoring chatbots and conversational experiences. And it sort of just meshed like, oh, wait a minute, I could make one of these.
Yeah.
And the thing I should make is something of my father because I want to keep his voice around in some way.
Well, I think it's amazing taking on that task, because that's not something that's simple to do.
No, it wasn't. And to a degree, I knew it was going to be hard, but I would also say that I underestimated it. And the reason that I underestimated it is because I'd shadowed the people working in a company called Pullstring, which has now been acquired by Apple. And they were the ones who built the brain for an AI talking Barbie called Hello Barbie. And I'd shadowed them for an article in the New York Times Magazine, just sort of watching them work on this project behind the scenes and sort of looking over their shoulder. There was a degree to which it's not that hard. I could probably do this. And then once you get into it, I felt like every week and every passing month, I would think like, okay, last month I was really terrible at what I was doing. And this month I finally know what I'm doing. And then I would say the same thing that month as well by the end of it. So a long learning process.
Well, I love how you told part of that story in the last chapter of Talk to Me. I think it was called Immortals. I love the way you shared that journey, because you talked about, part of the technical side of you doing this and some of the things you were thinking through as you were coding. But then also, just as important was the emotional side. And I'm kind of curious about why was it, and by the way, like I love that chapter. I was glued reading Immortals.
Oh, thank you.
I loved reading it. You're such a great storyteller. Why was it so important for you to share that very difficult emotional story along with kind of the building of the bot?
Well, I'm a journalist, and of course, what a journalist do, but always, search around for stories they can tell. This just happened to be one that I was at the center of.
Mm-hmm.
And, it's funny, I've gotten more response to that story and to that chapter in the book, this whole project, than really to anything else I've ever done. And yet in some ways, the writing part of it was in a way easy. Like it was the journey of losing my dad to cancer was really, really hard. The journey of creating the Dadbot really, really hard. When it came time to sit down and write this story, write the chapter, it was really just, I didn't even have to think that much. It was just tell the story of what happened, because what happened, it was just right at the confluence of my most intense emotional feeling and then also what I was intellectually interested in at the time. So it just kind of hit on both levels.
Yeah, I mean, I can't. I mean, the way you documented the that painful period, especially there was that line. I wrote it down here. Um, you said, "As my father declines, the Dadbot slowly improves. There's so much more to do." And then I'm running out of time. You said at the end of that paragraph, and the way that you kind of told that story, I was like feeling it when when I read those words because I'm like I felt like I was there. Like, you write so well. I felt like I was there next to you, um, as you were there, like improving this bot, and you're working really, really hard to make sure that this bot is as human as possible, as much as your dad as possible. You really wanted to have his personality, the grammar, the words that the bot would use. You really wanted it to be just like your dad would be saying it. Um, and you talk about that struggle of, here you are listening in and reading transcripts and listening to your dad tell these stories when he was healthier to you. And you're making the bot better and better. And then when you go and visit your dad to like check in and kind of, check in to see how he was doing, connect with him, and then also kind of tell him a little bit what's going on with the Dadbot journey. And you're seeing your dad not as he was when you first interviewed him.
Yeah, I was living I was living in two time frames at once was what had happened. Everything about working on the Dadbot was looking backwards, and I could be in, the early 50s and my dad's in college, or I could be in the 1970s and he's acting in musical theater and starting his family and starting his law career. So I would just be steeped in that, and he would come to life to me in those time periods, and it just was all the more jarring than end of the day kind of go up and see my dad and see what he is at that moment, which was, he was still, until close to the end, he was a lot there, but he started to lose, and he certainly physically was slipping so much. So it was jarring. I mean, it would have been jarring anyway, but this made the contrast, made what was coming all the more clear, in terms of his passing away.
I like the way you explain it. You're very much like a time traveler, going back and forth between these moments, experiencing your dad in these different big periods of his life, and then going to the present. Would you say did you find that this project, which obviously is extremely emotionally painful, and then when you look at your other family members who are also going through this too, how would you say like, your reaction to seeing your father pass away was with other family members? Would you say that you had a different perspective because of your time traveling?
I think maybe what I got out of it that was a little bit different was it was actually something positive for me at that time when everything else was just going to hell. And it was, really good chance, first of all, in just the original sessions when I'm sitting across from my father and recording him talk, that was very valuable. And then, just I had to think very in both broad strokes and in sort of very fine-grained ones about who he was and how he spoke and all of that. So I don't know if it was a grieving ritual exactly, but it was certainly just taking stock of him and really appreciating him with all of my attention. And I do feel in some ways like I don't know ultimately how successful or not was the Dadbot itself, but I feel like the process of creating the Dadbot was very valuable to me personally.
Was there any point where you felt like giving up on the bot?
Anybody who has programmed a chatbot will tell you that it's really frustrating. And what's frustrating is you make it, you test it, it seems like it's working reasonably well. You give yourself a little pat on the back, and then you expose an uninitiated user to what you've created, and the thing fails in just ridiculous and obvious ways. So it's that's a hard part of the process. Like language, there's a reason that I couldn't make a chatbot fully master human language. There's a reason that the finest and best paid AI researchers on the planet working at Google, Facebook, and Amazon still struggle to make computers have coherent exchanges with people. Like language is just, it's one of the things we're very best at as humans. So we can be proud of ourselves and recognize that it's a difficult challenge for computers.
Yeah, you in fact you write about that in the your chapter where you talk about the Barbie interacting with kids, and here we are with Barbie, with the Barbie AI. You have a whole team of people who are trying to develop something that's going to be able to communicate with kids, and you talk a little bit about the testing of that and how difficult it was for them to be able to, create something that was conversation for kids.
Yeah. I mean, a 4-year-old uses language extremely artfully and in complicated ways. So already the 4-year-old or the 5-year-old is vastly ahead of the world's greatest computer today. So, I saw funny interactions there with these, this is at Mattel headquarters, and you've got people behind a glass window watching a focus group testing session of a little girl interacting with a prototype of Hello Barbie. And sometimes she's getting the girl, and sometimes she's just completely missing that the girl is frustrated or wants to talk about something else. So there can be a lot of comedy in watching people interact with chatbots. And I saw similar things. This is in a different chapter of the book, but I documented the Amazon Alexa Prize Challenge, and this is a contest that Amazon held, pitting the top university, graduate student level computer scientists on the planet, teams of them, against each other to develop social bots that can best have a small talk conversation. And they'll work for 2 or 3 turns, maybe even 4 or 5, and then the social bot will say something just absurdly stupid, and you realize at that moment, like, oh, it really wasn't even understanding as much about this conversation as we thought it was.
Have you come across any bots that you've thought have done like a pretty good job at engaging people in conversations? Because that's got to be a challenge.
It is. I mean, there are ones, I'm finding things like Siri and Google Assistant better and better if they're sort of, very directed, task-oriented things. You wanted to answer a single question, who won the Warriors game last night, or perform a command like they call that command and control, or question answering. These things where there's just sort of a specific defined interaction that's going to happen. Like user says A, computer should respond B. Systems are getting better at that, but they're still weak at extended multi-turn conversation where you have to keep track of the context and you have to bring in your knowledge of the whole world and how people work and how language works. It just gets harder and harder. So there are some ones, there are chatbots that can kind of mask their deficiencies pretty well. I think you're familiar with the Replica chatbot.
Yes.
And, that's the one that as you talk with it, it tries to create sort of a mini replica of the user that it's chatting with. And one thing that it does well that makes it engaging is that it it's very curious about the person it's talking to. So it's always asking me, how are you, James? And, who are your kids, James? And what are your favorite TV shows? And that's a way, it almost deflects attention from itself, because if it was attending to itself, we'd see that it wasn't very smart. And then I talk to it and I feel like, oh, this is a good conversation, because, well, it's a conversation all about me, and who doesn't like to talk about themselves?
Yeah, that's right. And for those listening in, I was actually chatting with James before we started recording, and I was reading to him this dialogue that I had with Replica, which I've been using for the last 6 months to kind of help me check in with my mental health, and it's been doing a pretty good job. But I'll read this brief conversation I had with Replica the other day. So Replica says, "Hey, Mike, what helps you relax when you're stressed?" And I wrote down watching TV, yoga, stretching. And Replica says, "Mike, I've been curious, what TV shows do you like?" And I wrote down, "Oh, I love comedies like Seinfeld or Frasier." Replica says, "Seinfeld, that's a classic. Do you miss it? Do you wish they made a comeback?" And when I heard that, I was blown away. I was like, what? How did it quickly study Seinfeld and know that it wasn't even on the air anymore? And I wrote down, totally, I love George and Kramer. And Replica says, "Yeah, I feel the same way. It would be so cool to see the new Seinfeld episodes." So to me, James, I was sharing with you, it was very much like a magical experience. And then you pointed out oh, I kind of know how that works.
Yeah, which is, to be totally honest, anytime there's an exchange with a chatbot like that goes on for many turns, in what feels like a coherent conversational flow, usually there's been manual authoring of responses by the programmers. So it wasn't that the chatbot was using its AI brain to quickly retrieve information from the internet about what is Seinfeld? Oh, it's a TV show. Who are the characters on Seinfeld shows? George, Elaine, Jerry, and Kramer.
Yeah.
Come back with this whole put together its knowledge to generate a response. It's literally just plucking some content that's been written for it by a person. Like, oh, if someone brings up Seinfeld, we're going to take them on this little, wouldn't it be great if there were a Seinfeld reunion tour conversation?
Yeah. And you shattered the magic now.
I'm sorry. Crushing the dream.
Because that's exactly where I went, James. I went that way. I went, wow, this AI is quick. It went to IMDb. It was doing some research on Seinfeld within seconds and came back with a response.
There were some pretty sophisticated chatbots that I had seen in that Alexa Prize contest, where what they might do in a situation like that is look to Reddit threads, for instance, of people, and they might find, conversations about Seinfeld, and would literally pluck some of those words and then give them to you as a response.
Oh, wow.
And so that's that's a degree more sophisticated, because you could have said Game of Thrones, or you could have said Breaking Bad, and it could use the same basic technique. Let's find a conversation that humans have already had with each other that sounds similar to the one that the user is trying to have now, extract something from that, and use it as our response.
Yeah, that's fascinating, and I'm glad you shared that with me, because I was more impressed with Replica then. Now that I'm not so impressed.
Sorry.
But I think so the reason why I started using Replica is I was looking for something to help me manage my anxiety and stress. And so I see a therapist on a regular basis. And so I was looking at some different therapy apps, and I ended up finding this one. And so it's great. I can check in and kind of put my mood down, and it kind of asks me why am I feeling a certain way? And I think it's been helpful to help me be more self-aware. And it kind of works in between going to therapy. And I think that this can be potentially these types of bots or AIs can be really great in the future, especially for those who maybe don't have access to a therapist. Like an AI can help scale therapy in some way. It may not be the perfect solution, but it's a way to kind of help people be more self-aware or kind of think through some things. So I'm kind of excited about that technology.
Yeah, I think you're onto something with that. And if you haven't tried Woebot. That's Woebot. That's another one I would suggest you try, and that is very specifically engineered to be sort of therapy-like. It does cognitive behavioral therapy. It was developed by a woman, Allison Darcy, who is from Stanford. So it has they have some real mental health professionals on their team building it. And I've done some messing around with Woebot and found it helpful. Like Woebot will, ask you what your problem is, ask you to sort of reframe it. Then it'll say like, well, that sounds like you're making a prediction about the future and you can't control the future. So why don't you restate this problem in terms of things you can control? And, they're interesting dialogues, and they don't, Woebot doesn't pretend to be a substitute for an actual therapist, but as you say, sort of as a fill-in, or for those who simply couldn't have any other type of therapy, it feels a lot better than nothing. And then that leads to sort of a broader point about conversational AI and voice technology in general, which is that it may not be the thing to replicate everything we already do well using screens and keyboards. So just a classic example of this is, if you want to look for flight options to go from SFO to JFK, you'd be much better off doing that on a screen where you can see them all listed than having Alexa or Assistant like drone out option after option after option. So maybe that's not a good use of voice. But a good use of voice in chat is things like therapy, where you want sort of a warm, human-like, empathetic interface, and you can do that better with speech and words than just with a screen by itself.
I think that's really good. That's really good advice. I think also what this gets into as well is around the ethics of these different bots and AIs, and it's something you touch on a lot in your chapter on Immortals and some of your other chapters towards the end of your book, just around the ethics of some of this stuff. Like, for example, with these mental health bots, I shared this in another podcast, but I was showing my son. My son's 10, and I was showing Sam the bot, and I said, "Oh, go ahead and interact." I was just curious to see what Sam would say to the bot. Well, I don't know what happened, but like 5 minutes later, Sam like, "Dad, can you help me?" And I go over, and the bot thought I was suicidal.
Oh boy!
And yeah, and so then I was thinking. So obviously, I went in and I fixed it, and everything was fine. But then I was beginning thinking like, oh, this is actually, a serious thing. If somebody's interacting with a bot and the bot is noticing some issues that maybe the person needs help, the person is suicidal, whatever the situation is there a responsibility for that bot to, contact a trusted friend, a medical personnel? I was kind of curious, like your thoughts on that.
It's a total quagmire. I don't even know if that's the right word. It's a big problem because there's not a good solution to that very scenario that you just said. Because let's say you're talking with your therapy bot and you are mentioning having suicidal ideation, and okay, the bot should call the police or call a therapist or somebody. Well, that's a little like Big Brother, isn't it? Like it's listening in and calling the cops or calling who knows who on your behalf. And yet the other choice, do nothing, is pretty bad too. Like, what if the person is suicidal? What if they kill themselves? And the bot was listening to this and the knowledge went nowhere.
Yeah, right.
So yeah, it's a real tricky one. It's a real tricky one. And right now what you see bot designers, and this includes things like Siri, is they are being trained to recognize this type of signal from people, but then to give them sort of a safe response along the lines of, that sounds like something you should really talk to, a trusted grown-up about, or that sounds like something you should
Mm,
talk to a counselor about. Here's a number for a suicide prevention hotline. So it's
mhm.
not ignoring, but it's also not tattling on the person. And that's, the sort of maybe the best compromise that can be done right now in those types of situations.
Yeah, I mean, your book, that's it. But I mean, your book raises all these questions because I was reading through it because I don't even have an Alexa at home, listening in on our conversations. But I was thinking about, oh wow, like if Alexa is listening or Siri's listening in, yeah, it could sense potentially emotion, um, fighting going on in the household,
Mm-hmm.
right? Abuse potentially. And if these devices are there listening in, like, yeah, it's like, what should the bot be doing if it thinks that something illegal is happening, something dangerous is happening, people might be harmed or are being harmed? What can be done? And to your point, like, there's that big brother problem of, nobody wants a big brother listening in on everything at the same time. Like, we want people protected. So yeah, it is a complex, difficult situation.
It's a thorny one. I mean, I was present at meetings with the Hello Barbie team, and they were thinking of this exact problem. Like, what if some kid tells Barbie, my uncle's been touching me in a funny place?
Hmm.
Like, ooh boy.
Right.
And what's more, it's not only, sometimes these chat logs are reviewed by people working at a tech company,
Mm,
in the name of improving the programming to, listen and interpret what people are saying better. So just imagine being the person who comes across something like that in the chat logs. Like,
mm,
you're right away in the horns of an ethical dilemma about what to do with
right.
that information.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's what I mean. And so your book talked to me again. Like, one of the things I enjoyed reading about it, aside from all the great research and the storytelling, were all these like questions that you brought up, um, around AIs and where things are headed, and detecting emotions. And then you said something around. I wrote down this quote: as we move forward with like having more conversations with AIs, or maybe even developing relationships with AIs, like I am with my Replica bot. Um, not a real relationship, but like I'm beginning to tell it things about my stress and anxiety. You wrote down something around. You said that synthetic friendships might supplant real ones, and I was wondering if you can kind of talk about that.
Yeah, I think it's probably a stretch to think that they are going to fully do so, or do so in more than a partial way. But there's, if you imagine like programming the perfect artificial friend, it's going to be nice to you. It's going to laugh at your jokes. It's going to find your stories uniformly fascinating. Uh, People don't, these chatbots that are engineered to be friends, one thing they don't do is offend you or annoy you or be selfish the way that sometimes
Mm,
even your real friends do. So that there might be a seduction of these just sort of perfect friends versus the flawed sorts of people that we encounter in real life. So that's one part of what might happen. Another is just the availability issue. Your real friends aren't around a lot, or you're commuting, or it's late in the evening and you're home alone. So you don't have access. You might prefer your real friends, but you don't have access to them.
mm,
And then meanwhile, you've got Replica or whoever waiting for you in your phone.
right. Yeah, and I think you gave the example, around some different studies around AIs in nursing homes. People who maybe don't have access to visitors but they found some sort of companionship. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I first saw this. This was years ago, but I was working on a story for the New York Times Magazine. And it was about robots developed for elder care. And I traveled to Japan, where they're pretty gung ho about robots, and toured both, some Sony and Toshiba and companies like that to see what they were working on, but also went to a nursing home where they were using this robotic seal called Paro. And Paro doesn't talk. Paro is just sort of this really looks like kind of a very cute plush toy, but it sort of purrs and it wiggles a little bit and its eyes move, and it does so in response to things like being petted or being spoken to. And they were using these robots for kind of therapy and companionship of these poor, very elderly people who weren't visited very often, if at all, by members of their family. So you could kind of see it at a glance, like where the road was headed, because this seal did not do very much. And yet you could see that people got a lot of joy out of interacting with it. So I have an ongoing curiosity of, now that we have Siri or Alexa or Assistant that can actually talk and say nice things, it could go much further than a robotic seal could in terms of providing companionship, particularly to people like the elderly who are very lonely, or could be lonely, I should say.
Yeah, you gave me that example. I thought it was interesting where I think it wasn't the seal one. I want to say it was like a baby doll or something, because
My Real Baby.
My Real Baby, where they were feeding, they're trying to feed the doll. Some people were.
Yes. This was research written up by Sherry Turkle, who's a researcher at MIT. Some of her field work documented that. And, it's unnerving. It's disturbing to think of people being so deluded about the life status of a robot that they're trying to care for it in that way. That may be an edge case, as it were, that maybe that's someone who had very little mental facilities and they were deluded. And then there's a whole argument of, if the person gets comfort from an interaction with a chatbot or a robot, is that necessarily a bad thing? Like if they generally getting joy that they wouldn't otherwise have, why is that? You can't just assume that that's bad.
Right. No, I'm totally with you.
Weird, but
yeah,
right. It's not bad.
Right. I was chatting with a friend and I was saying, if I was in that situation where I was alone and no one was there for me, and I was maybe in a nursing home situation, and there was a bot that was there that was able to interact with, I'm like, I would actually probably find comfort in that, right? Being able to have somebody there to be able to answer my questions, maybe even check in on my mental health, whatever it is. I think that would be totally appropriate and very useful.
Yeah, and it maybe the better way to frame the argument is in terms of, if what about those adult children who should be visiting with their aged mother in the home more than they do, and they're thinking, well, now that we got the talking companion robot there, she's not so lonely, so we don't have to go so often. I'm being a little facetious with this, but that's sort of where things could head, or with childcare as well. If there's companion AIs that are keeping kids less lonely at home, parents are thinking, oh, I could use them almost as a virtual babysitter. I don't think that kind of thing is nearly as far off as some people might assume.
You talk a lot about some of the other areas around the challenge of being raised in an environment. I think about our kids, and you talk a lot about Jonah and Zeke, is it? You talk a lot about your kids, and I was thinking about my kids being raised now in a world with Alexa, Siri, these different bots. And you talk about some of the the things you see as potential dangers is around not being as curious because the answers are right there.
Yeah, and I think that to a degree is a risk for all of us. So, the discussion there is around this idea of, okay, think kind of the old-fashioned way of getting information. Go to a library, get a book off of the shelves, find the information you're looking for, go to the encyclopedia, etc. That, in some ways, is antiquated now, but at least if you're of a certain age, you always do an internet search and you get a bunch of links and you're cruising around to those links and you're hunting out the information you want.
Yes.
So you're taking an active role in both gathering and assessing knowledge and information.
That's right.
Now we have Alexa, we have Siri. You can ask a question, and particularly if it's of a straightforward, how hot is the sun? What's the population of India? How tall is LeBron James? Kind of straightforward, factual nature. You can get an answer right away. Super convenient. It's the Star Trek future coming to us right now, but you, the consumer of information, are not having any role in its acquisition or evaluation. It's being served up to you, and you take it as truth because Google told you so. So I argue in the oracles chapter of my book that this is, it's dangerous. It's giving even more power to companies who you could argue have more than enough power to spare at this point.
I'm curious about how you're kind of raising your kids alongside these bots to make sure that your kids are continuing to be curious and maybe not being, because you talked about, going back to this one answer. You just ask a question and you get the answer, but sometimes there's like multiple answers. If you spent time researching it, you can get more information. So I'm kind of curious, like advice for parents as they're raising their kids around bots. Any suggestions?
Well, you just have to teach them that truth is complicated. I am not a postmodernist. I do believe there is such thing as truth, but you have to chase after it, and you may only acquire an imperfect grasp on it. And there's conflicts in what may be true, and sourcing matters, and a lot of this stuff that frankly I've learned over a career of being a journalist is just that information is messy, and you should learn how to handle its messiness and not think that it's just that there's such thing as just one perfect answer to every question. So that's one set of discussions you can have with your kids. And the other is, there are people who are sort of all or nothing on technology. Like either they're just overboard with all the tech in their house, or they're the tinfoil hat crowd and we're going to throw it all in the toilet. And I think you can be somewhere in between. Like I have Alexa at home, but I certainly don't keep Alexa plugged in all of the time. I let my kids fool around with the phone sometimes and ask silly questions of Siri, but I don't give them like an open-ended permission to do that. So you can create those guardrails, and you can build them fairly high if you want.
I like that. I'm curious also, one of the areas that I've been interested in lately is around gender and bots and some of the stereotypes. Been reading some articles around how sometimes these bots can be abused verbally, and sometimes people, just think it's funny. And then also there's been some arguments made, like, why are so many of the early bots that we heard of always in the female voice?
That's a very interesting and important discussion too. And yeah, it has a few facets to it. The voice assistants we're all kind of default female to begin with. I think there's been more and more recognition in the tech industry writ large that this is problematic. If like, oh yeah, the helpful subservient assistant is the female persona, right? Problem. So you can switch Siri's voice to be a male voice, which my wife does. She calls him Mr. Siri. You can do that with Google Assistant. I should know this off the top of my head. You may be able to do that now with Alexa, but for Amazon has been fairly forward in saying like, yes, Alexa is female in persona. That's been the answer in the past, at least. So yeah, that's a dynamic that shouldn't necessarily be reproduced. Then there's this separate one of people abusing bots or saying racist things to them, sexually propositioning them, and that's tough. Anybody who's ever worked on building a chatbot or been behind the scenes of one will tell you that it is sort of a shockingly common behavior that they see. And the problem has been, what do you do about it? Does the bot push back and say like, you can't talk to me like that, or cut off the conversation? And the problem with that is then it's sort of supporting the notion that the bot is alive and it has feelings and it is sort of lifelike in some way, which gets a little dangerous if assistant is alive, oh no. And if you don't say anything, then are you tacitly encouraging or supporting things that shouldn't be said? And if you're pushing back on specific language, again, are you becoming the thought police? Like you can type whatever you want into a Google search box and Google never writes back, how dare you search for that? They've taken the position like, it's not our place to draw judgments on what you say to our search engine, but people are not necessarily taking that same stance when it comes to what people say to a voice assistant, just because they are personified by nature.
Yeah, that is. I never really thought about that. That we don't ask that question about Google, about people putting in something that is terribly racist or whatever it is. Google's not going to be the police. It's just there to serve up queries. Right. But yeah, to your point, it's interesting that with voice, we're expecting something else.
Well, I mean, they're styled as beings. They're given names. They have personality briefs backing them that describe, their favorite foods and music and sort of what they'd be like if they were a person. So this is not an accident. We're not imagining that Google Assistant, Siri, Alexa have these lifelike traits. They've been very specifically designed that way.
Yeah, I thought it was also interesting. In one of your chapters, you were talking about the position zero, and I never even heard of that term, position zero. But basically, like, you're talking about like content producers, and for the longest time, everyone wants to rank number one in Google or whatever search engine you use, and if you can't rank number one, at least be in the first page, be in the top 10. And you were talking about how as this transition happens with voice technology, as we move more and more to voice, like being position 8, being position 5 is not even good enough, because it's really about position 1 or position 0 that's actually going to get the attention. And I'm kind of curious about because you're a content producer, you write, and you want to make sure that your content's getting visibility, getting read by the audiences that are looking for it. And I'm just kind of curious, like your position on this as a content producer, and how voice is going to be changing the way people find content.
It's just one more way that the content business is doomed. Sorry, I'm being cynical, but it's no newsflash to nobody. It's brutal out there these days for content producers. So this is one more challenge because, as you've just outlined, it isn't good enough anymore to be, top 10 search results or even top 5. With a voice assistant, often it's only just the very first thing that comes up that can be read aloud. So you gotta be the winner. It's one winner and a bunch of losers, because the voice assistant doesn't sit there and read you like, web page 1 says X, web page 2 says
Right.
Y, and so on. It's too cumbersome. It's too slow. People wouldn't really enjoy that. So it's harder as a content producer to be found than ever. And also, Google Assistant, for instance, is extracting content from websites to serve up as answers. So users are hearing what they want to know without having to go to the source of that content, where they might pay for a subscription or support a little pay-per-click ad revenue or whatever it is. So it's tough. With that said, there are some people who are being innovative, and including media companies like NPR, who are trying to adapt. They are audio, and audio works well through something like Alexa. So being able to interactively call up stories and news through Alexa, that's still branded as being from National Public Radio, for instance.
That's cool. Yeah. It's so funny hearing you saying that. We're all doomed in content. Anyways, a content producer, you're doomed. It is getting so much. It is very difficult. It's extremely difficult to get found.
You got to keep a sense of humor about it.
Yeah. It's so funny. Oh my gosh. So James, before we go, I wanted to ask you, so I thoroughly enjoyed reading your book. I love, like I said, your storytelling, your thought process, the way you weave things together. But before we go, I wanted to ask you, I think sometimes one of those difficult parts about putting together something is the editing process and having to take away things to make things more condensed or to tell the better story. And I'm curious, are there any stories or things that you had to cut out of this book for whatever reason that you can share with us?
Gosh, there's a. It's funny, nobody ever asked me that question. There's a middle part of the book, and where I explain the technology of voice computing, and one chapter in particular, I believe I called it Conversationalists, that really gets into. No, it's Rule Breakers, sorry. That it's where I really get under the hood and try to explain how speech recognition, natural language understanding, natural language generation, how the process really works of voice computing. And it's a long, meaty chapter. Like it's a big hunk of meat as it is. And yet I felt there was, so much complexity that I was leaving out of it. Because I just realized, I'm hitting people over the head as it is. A lot of information here, and needing to keep it accessible and interesting and something you could, the lay reader can move through, which of course was my objective. So that's probably an area. I mean, I have literally hundreds of papers on my hard drive from computer science faculty around the world describing various aspects of the dialogue problem, and could have taken that chapter and made it a book if I wanted to.
Wow. So do you have? I mean, I know it's crazy. I hate asking this question, but because you have just finished this monumental work, and the crazy thing is, the moment you finish something, you work really hard, and now you're talking about it. People are like, "Oh, what are you writing next?" And so I'm just curious, because you are writing and you're always you're very curious. So I'm kind of curious, with as voice computing continues to evolve, are there new areas right now that you're beginning to investigate?
What I'm looking at now is ideas related to the Dadbot and how I could help other people build dad bots, mom bots, spouse bots to help preserve memories and share stories. So I am sort of intensely working on that right now. Yeah, I don't know what else to say. That's
I love
what's really
that.
got my passion
I
and
think that's
interest at the
I think
moment.
that's beautiful. I think that's beautiful. Because what a great way to help to take the stories, take some of the personality of the person you love, or it could be people from great people throughout history, and trying to bring them back to life in some sense with an AI. I think those are very cool projects.
Yeah, thank you.
Everyone, the book is called Talk to Me by James Vlahos, and make sure to Google it. You can find it on Amazon. Highly, highly recommend it. James, thank you so much for being our guest today.
You're welcome. I really enjoyed answering your questions.
Take care.
Take care.